Hi everyone, welcome to Let's Talk Latin. The goal of this channel is to offer several different views of how to study Latin. My hope is to go through several textbook series, things like Wheelock's Latin, Ecce Romani, and Latin for the New Millennium, and work through the best ways that they describe learning Latin, including what order to learn the material in. My hope is to have new videos for you frequently enough that you can decide what textbook track you'd like to study and work with, as well as offer you my own home-created tests, quizzes, and other assignments. The first thing we need to do, though, before we can get into Latin study, is talk about the basics. This is where pretty much every textbook is going to start anyway, so I figured we could just smoosh them all into one lesson and talk about the most basic things about Latin that you need to know in order to study it. If you're wondering what my particular credentials are, I am a high school Latin teacher, so I am familiar with this language, I am used to working with it, and I'm hoping that you'll become comfortable with it as well. So let's talk basics. The first thing you need to know about Latin is the parts of speech, and conveniently enough, they're the same as they are in English. Nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, pronouns, conjunctions, and interjections. Pretty much your standard English fare. Your nouns, person, place, thing, idea. Verbs, actions. Adjectives, describe nouns. Adverbs can describe nouns or verbs or adjectives, that kind of thing, right? Prepositions are used to form prepositional phrases. Words like under or around or near. Pronouns are tiny little words that replace nouns. He, she, it, they. Conjunctions are those connectors of ideas or sentences like and but. And interjections are the things that you would shout out in speech, like hey or oh no. All of those fall into Latin as well. So that'll be easy enough. It's not like there's anything new and scary in terms of parts of speech that you're going to need to learn. And we'll talk about later, there's actually a really familiar part of speech to us in English that does not happen in Latin, which makes things that much easier. When we're talking about the basics of nouns, it's important to keep in mind that Latin is a declined language, which means that nouns have specific endings based on how they're used in a sentence. The ending on a noun that is a subject looks different than the ending on a noun that is a direct object or an indirect object or a possessive. We have patterns for these endings, so you don't have to make everything up all on your own, and these patterns are called declensions. There are 5 noun declensions in Latin. The first 3 are the most popular, but 4 and 5 also have some pretty important nouns in them as well. Another thing you should know about nouns is that they are gendered, which means they are either masculine, feminine, or neuter. Some words are bound to have natural gender. For instance, the word for mother, mater, is obviously going to be feminine. The word for brother, frater, is obviously going to be masculine. But words also have grammatical gender too. So a word like ocean, sea, well, what gender is that going to be? Well, in Latin, mare, it's neuter. So that's something you have to learn when you're learning your vocabulary, is what gender nouns have. Some of them, like I've explained, are going to be obvious based on what that person would be anyway. But for regular everyday objects, you're going to have to learn. And that can be frustrating, but it's really important to do so. Another thing that nouns have are called numbers. And we have this in English too. Your noun is either going to be singular or plural. So there's a difference between cat and cats, right? There's a difference between desk and desks. That same thing happens in Latin too. The endings in those declensions are going to change based on not only how the nouns are used, but also whether they are singular or plural. Those endings, again, show how nouns are used in a sentence, and that's called case. So nouns have three really big identifiers: gender, whether they're masculine, feminine, or neuter; number, whether they're singular or plural; and case. There are 5 really common cases in Latin and 2 less common cases in Latin. So we'll get to those another time. We would be remiss not to talk about verbs if we're going to talk about nouns. What you need to know about Latin is it's a full conjugation language, which means that verbs have specific endings, again, to denote specific things. Verbs actually show 5 things when they are fully conjugated. They show the person, which is who the subject is. Now, there are 3 options here: first person, second person, or third person. First person, just like in English, is going to be like me or us. Second person is going to be you or you all. I'm from the Midwest, so more colloquially, I would say y'all. I have some students who prefer to say you all or you guys for second person plural. And then third person is going to be your somebody else: he, she, or it in the singular, or they in the plural. Which also brings up that verbs also have number, singular or plural, which is going to match the number of the subject. So if the cats are running, because cats is plural, running is going to be plural as well. Verbs all have tense, which is the time when a verb happens. There are 6 main tenses in Latin in what is called the indicative mood. Now, a mood shows the verb's relationship to reality. Something that's in the indicative is factual, it happened, right? And that's what we're going to start with, mood-wise. But there are other moods, well, like imperative and subjunctive, that we can get into later. And lastly, verbs have voice. The choices here are active voice or passive voice. And if you're not super familiar with these in English, it's probably because English teachers tend not to like us to use the passive voice in English, but in Latin, we really like to use the passive voice. So, what voice is going to do for you is tell you whether the subject is the one performing the action or having the action performed on them. For instance, there's a difference between I throw the ball and the ball is thrown, right? In the first sentence, it's active voice. The ball is still receiving the action, but it's not the subject. But in the second sentence, the ball is thrown. We can see that something's happening to the ball, but the ball is the subject. That's the difference between active and passive voice. In Latin, to distinguish between different endings, we have patterns as well. For verbs, these are called conjugations. If you're anything like me, you're going to call declensions conjugations and conjugations declensions pretty much interchangeably, not on purpose, but just because you get screwed up, and that's okay. I do it all the time. There are about 4 conjugations in Latin. There's kind of an extra half one that we'll talk about when we get there. And there are a few irregular verbs that happen to be really important verbs. Generally speaking, the more you use a word, the more likely it is to become irregular. So just like in English, the verb to be, for instance, is an irregular verb. Let's get into sentence structure then, with what the basic sentence structure is for Latin. In English, our basic sentence structure is subject, verb, object. So the girl loves the water, right? I throw the ball. We really like to know what the verb is ahead of time. It's a big English thing, but in Latin, the subject is first with the object coming second. And the verb will generally come last. Now, of course, this is basic sentence structure, and all of our lovely literature in Latin will show you that people bend the rules just like they do in English. But you're generally going to see something more like this Latin sentence: Puella aquam amat. The girl loves the water, with the water in the middle and the verb at the end. Especially as you start out in these early levels of the textbook, this is what they're going to start you with, just to get you used to finding where's the subject, where's the object, where's the verb. Then as more complex grammatical entities are introduced, that's the time when your sentence structure will start to get a little bit more fun as well. Something you may notice is that the English sentence has 2 more words in it than the Latin sentence does, and that's because we don't have articles like a, an, or the in Latin. In fact, they are implied based on context. So I would know whether it was the girl or just a girl, right? Those don't happen in Latin, so that's really nice. It's one less thing you have to worry about, one less word you have to memorize. But when we translate from Latin to English, we can imply those sort of articles. And that's that. That's your Latin basics. So, I hope you have learned something here about the basics of Latin. And I hope to see you next time here on Let's Talk Latin.